Good evening. Welcome to you all, and my name is Kirsten Spencer. I am a senior lecturer at AUT, specialising in performance analysis and sports coaching. My background is such that I played field hockey to international level and know some of your South African players. But when I moved to New Zealand from England, much of my early research was actually in the sport of netball. So what I've been invited to talk to you today is about a recent piece of research where I looked at the injuries associated, particularly in secondary school netball. So I've titled this presentation Netball Happy Landings, and it's very much related to looking at the junior school or the secondary school netball players and then analysing their movement patterns and then correlating that with injuries that occurred. So netball currently, it's a sport played by over 20 million people, more than 70 countries. It's incredibly popular. Obviously in New Zealand we're quite proud of at the moment because we are netball world champions, which is superb. So this is a very pertinent piece of research. So as you know, your netball coaches, we've got specific playing positions for each of the roles. And it's interesting that the playing positions, as I go through this presentation, you'll see that the position that you play actually does have an implication for the likelihood of injury. So the research, when you delve a bit deeper, shows us that netball players have a high incidence of lower limb injuries, and it's generally attributed to the landing strategies used in competition. So the specific position that you play will have a particular contextual demand, and that requirement for that position will influence the landing strategies that the players choose. So in the competition environment, factors that determine landing strategy are the netball footwork rule, the type of pass, so it could be a straight or a loop or a bounce pass, the height of the pass, is it an overhead, is it a chest, or is it below waist, the closeness of the opposition, so is it pressure high, pressure low, and then the landing space that we have available. So is it enough space for unilateral landing, bilateral landing, and what is the action which is achievable in the landing space that we have. Now here in New Zealand, it's an incredibly expensive sport to the country. So in 2016, netball injuries cost ACC, which is our accident compensation company, that actually cost New Zealand 28 million New Zealand dollars. And if we look at the stats there, we'll see that most of these injuries occur to females in the 15 to 25 age bracket. It's the intermediate age girls who are injured most frequently, and there's a high level of reoccurrence of injury. So once you've had an injury at netball, particularly if we go for, say, for example, the ACL, there's a high likelihood of a re-rupture. So it's important to consider the landing aspects. It's very much part when I talk to the netball coaches here in New Zealand, landing strategy is very important. So a high experience of overhead passes in netball compels the netballer to jump and receive. So these jumps, which can be vertical, forward, or in a lateral direction, often involve the netballer turning in the air with either a unilateral or a bilateral landing. So if you look at this video, we can see what turned out to be a nasty ACL injury, where we've got a netballer jumping in the air with a turn on the land, and that's the result. So this jump and landing leads to ground reaction forces being imposed on the netballer, which can be up to 6.8 times the body mass. However, the landing strategy chosen, or as coaches that we've trained our netballers to use, has the potential to reduce these impact forces and so reduce the likelihood of or the possibility of injury. Now, research from elite adult netball suggested that better players would use, so that's more elite players, would use a bilateral or a run-on strategy, and so they actually experience a lower impact ground force because the forces are spread more evenly throughout the foot. So landing strategy is known to have an impact in terms of likelihood of injury. So the problem which I looked at, we've got 7 positions in netball. Do they all land the same? So we're looking to determine the distribution of landing strategies in high-level youth national competition. So this is the national secondary schools competition. And then the aim is that the information that we gathered from this on the distribution will assist netball coaches and S&C professionals to develop conditioning strategies for injury prevention and performance improvement from a position-specific perspective. So we've got does everybody land the same? Can we actually determine that there's a difference for landing strategy by grade? So in the secondary school netball competition, as you'll see, we have 3 different grades. And then how do we apply this knowledge that we've picked up or that we've learned from this into the actual sport? How do we actually implement this in terms of our coaching and training sessions? So I worked with a trained biomechanist, so a colleague of mine, Associate Professor Chris Watman, and one of the professors from the health faculty, Duncan Reed, and we looked at the landing strategies of 84 female netballers, and it was from 12 competitive games, and the data was from those who are in the elite level, so that's the first grade, and then the third grade, who are the two levels below. And we looked at landing strategy based upon their playing position. So the variables, which were what we call the dependent variables, were context. So what was the context of the landing strategy of the netball player? Right? Which zone were they in? How much pressure were they under? Okay. How did they receive the ball? So these are all the factors that vary. So how did they receive the ball? How many hands did they use to receive the ball? What height did they get to? Where was the ball in relation to where they received it? Relative to the body, and then what type of movement. Then from the jumping perspective, we looked at what was the direction of jump. Was it forward or was it lateral? Then landing, we looked at direction. Then we looked at ankle movement, foot movement, and then for balance, we looked at stability or instability. So balance is important because it contributes to the effective execution of the landing strategy. So whatever the netball player chooses, the ability to land in a stable position has great benefits towards reducing the likelihood of injury. So assessment of frequency of stability and unstable movements has been advocated as a good injury risk assessor. So 3 strategies we found were used to help maintain balance. It was either what we referred to as the ankle strategy. Okay, this is often used in static conditions where, for example, if we're talking basketball, the guard defense in the end zone, where a static balance is held for 3 seconds without falling into the opponent and creating an infringement. In dynamic situations, the ankle strategy is there to try to recover stability, and it's used when the disturbance to balance is minimal. The other strategy that we have is the hip strategy. Netballers would use this hip strategy to recover balance when they've made sort of large or fast corrections which are needed from the mediolateral and anterior posterior instability. So for example, if we put that into sort of coaching terminology, when we've had a netball player who's done a jump or a jump turn on landing, that's a high level of instability, and the netball player would use their hips to try to maintain balance upon landing. Now the stepping strategy, this generally indicates that the netballers failed to regain balance using either the ankle or the hip. So you'll see this when you have a netball player who jumps, they then land, they've tried to either use their ankle to stabilize themselves, or they've made a much bigger movement with their hips to try to stabilize themselves. They've still got motion moving forwards, so then they take another step. And generally speaking, the research suggests that that step strategy is synonymous with a lower skill level of landing. So to move on to our study then, this is what we looked at in our analysis. So we had descriptive data, then we looked at the difference between positions. So we're we looked at the differences to see if there's actually any statistical difference between them. Then for the second stage, we wanted to try to see if there was if we could predict the grade of the netballer based upon the landing strategy that was used. So we said, okay, if you're in grade A, you're going to be a better player than if you're in grade C. So if we took all of the results anonymously to grade, and we then looked at, okay, which landing strategy was used by which players, we wanted to see if actually the better players or the more elite players did use different landing strategies. So we looked across the whole netball tournament, and we looked at this distribution of landing strategies. Okay, player level, as I said, was either recorded as grade A or grade C. We then did some analysis so we could then try to determine, okay, actually, does this landing strategy, does it differ with what you might refer to as skill level or talent level of the individual? Okay, so the interesting bit, if we look at the results then, we got quite a few because we had a number of those independent variables. So the first one we looked at was context. So you'll see here that we've got all of the positions across the top here. Okay, and I've sort of tried to just highlight in this what are the interesting findings. So if we look initially, we'll see on this then that the goal attack and goal shooter, fairly normal here, they predominantly receive in the circle zone. The goal attack, significantly greater ball reception than the goalkeeper over the time frame of this study. So it's important really to take a consideration as to who's going to receive the ball more. And it could be different for the players that you're working with. But for this secondary school competition, we found the goal attack receives the ball significantly more than the goalkeeper. So therefore, if we're looking at injury likelihood, the goalkeeper is going to potentially do less movements, record less number of movements, so they are less likely to be injured. Now, this is a competition which runs across one whole week. So these are secondary school athletes, and they will be playing netball on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So I can assure you by the end of the week, there's a high level of injury because these athletes are not actually, their training status is probably not enough for them to be able to cope with the intensity of the games that they're playing. So if we look at the next context, so we're looking at the end third. Okay, so what we find here, the goalkeeper receives the ball significantly less again than either the centre, the goal attack, or the wing attack. It's important that we start to consider this because it's come up a few times that the goal attack actually does significantly less work. Sorry, not the goal attack. The goalkeeper does significantly less work than potentially some other positions. And again, this may not be the case in your teams, but this was what we found in our secondary school competition. So from a coaching and S&C perspective, the coach needs to be aware of this in the sort of design of training environments and to think about the expectations of work rate across this week-long tournament duration. So if we've got athletes, netball players who are used to playing 1 or 2 games a week, across 7 days, and then they're into this high intense environment where they are playing at least 5 matches across the course of the week, then what we find is that there is a much greater likelihood of injury because the training that the athletes have been doing with the coaches actually hasn't really prepared them enough for this increase in intensity. So if we look at the number of landings, okay, that we have here in the end third, so we can see here in the end third that we've got the centre and the wing attack. They have significantly more landings than the goal defence, the goal shoot, the wing defence in the end zone. So when we're working with these two players, the centre and the wing attack, and I have quite a few discussions with netball, particularly with the analysts at netball, and this is a frequent occurrence. So your centre and your wing attack are the two players who have a much greater workload than other players on the court. What was interesting for this study was that the previous research suggested that the centre player would actually have more landings in the midcourt, whereas our research found that our centre player actually had more landings in the end third. So again, when we're looking at designing our training patterns, there's a need here for us to consider how are we designing our training sessions so that our centre player becomes more practiced at receiving the ball in that end third, whereas the research previous to this would have suggested most of their reception would be in the mid-court. So if we look at the mid-court, there are actually no significant differences there. So whilst we've got goal defence and we've got wing defence have predominantly greater reception in the mid-court, there's actually no difference between the positions. So that mid-court zone, where traditionally the research suggests that the centre player really has the outstanding actions, our research found that this was not the case, and that for the mid-court players there was actually no significant difference between the frequency of reception and landing for our particular players. So if we look then at pressure, we can see that the pressure, the players when they are receiving their passes, so you want to look at this numbers as it's the netballer receiving the ball, how much pressure are they under? It's either high, medium or low. And if we look here at the centre player, we'll see that mainly in our tournament, and again, it may not be the same for you in South Africa here, but mainly for our players, the pressure is classed as medium, and it's sort of medium or low for most of the players. There's not a great deal of high intensity pressure even at this secondary schools competition. So for the pressure is an important point to consider, and it's quite important to consider this when you're discussing players who are in the elite levels at secondary school, and they might be thinking of making the next step up, or they're in the secondary school, they're in playing for their state side, and they are looking to develop, because the previous research suggests that pressure on the receiver is often attributed as a mechanism for ACL injury. So the results suggest from this study that medium to low pressure is the main experience of our players in all positions in the New Zealand National Schools netball competition. So this is actually conflicting with the experience that happens at elite level, where there's regular indirect contact occurring as the receiver gets the ball as a result of very high defensive pressure. You only have to have a look at the matches between South Africa, England, Australia and New Zealand to appreciate how the high pressure on the receiver, often you see it as a hit or a shove or the physical body contact. So when we're thinking about designing our training programs for our youngsters, it's something we need to consider here. It's useful, or a necessity I should say really, for the coaches of our school level to increase the frequency of pressure scenarios on the receiver in training, because we need to allow the player to develop these effective landing strategies based on this relationship between environmental task constraints, decision making and injury. So we want our players to be practicing the strategies which are going to reduce the likelihood of injury as they progress to international level. So if we summarize context then, the zones where these landing strategies occurred they're predominantly differentiated by position. The goal shooter, the goal attack and the goalkeeper are predominantly active in the circle zone. The centre and wing attack are mainly active in the end zone, and the goal defence and wing defence are principally active in the mid-court. So due to the movement restrictions placed on each position by the rules of the game, the goal shooter and goalkeeper zones, they're as expected, but the centre player's greater involvement in the end zone is contrary to previous research, which states that the mid-court is normally the main area of engagement and landing for centre players. So this suggests that when you're planning tactical training sessions, coaches, you want to start to consider planning actions that involve the centre player as receiving the ball in the end zone much more frequently than receiving it in the mid-court position, because that will allow you to replicate in the training environment actually what's going to happen in the match environment. So if we look at receiving then, so this is the how did the players actually receive the ball. So we've got the centre, the goal attack, the wing attack significantly receive the ball with two-hand catches compared to the goal defence and goal shooter. Now you're all netball coaches, so you'll be thinking, okay, that makes great sense. Got to protect the ball, make sure you've got a firm hold of it. Goal defense, goal shooter, tending to receive the ball in a position where the height is an important reception. And again, there's the Jamaican player who is incredibly tall, and she puts up one hand and that hand outstretches everybody else, so she has a really good opportunity to just stick up one hand and to receive the ball. If we look at where the ball is received, okay, then we've got the centre, the goal attack and the wing attack. They tend to receive significantly more passes than the more overhead passes than the goalkeeper. And if we look then at the leg movement, okay, so we are looking at the type of movement that is occurring as the player receives the ball. So we'll see here that we've got the leap step and we've got stationary, so that's a player standing still. This is the player who is leaping and then doing a step action. So the leap step receiving action is most frequently used by the wing attack and the centre. Now, when we start to relate this to injury, it's important that you appreciate this and you think now about your training environment, because this is the movement which requires a large degree of stability on landing, and it's been associated with a very high injury risk. So the leap step, very important implications for coaches and conditioners, is to increase your player awareness and training to try to use the hip balance strategy, okay, to reduce instability on landing, because this lessens the likelihood of injury from this action. So you're trying to get the players to consider their balance by sort of considering about where do they lean over their hip? Are they leaning outside of their body line? So you're asking the players, instead of doing a leap, as they do a leap and a step, to really think about focusing on that central core and the hip strategy to try to reduce any likelihood of injury. Regardless of position, players at this level are principally static. So this is, as I said, it's the netball secondary schools competition. This is the top players in the secondary school age in New Zealand. And regardless of whatever position they were, most of them were receiving the ball from a static position. Now, this reduces the impact of the footwork rule and suggests that deceleration may not be such a mitigating factor in injuries at this age group. If we take this to the next level, which is the elite level, where we have a lot of ball reception at a high speed, where deceleration is an important factor, then what we find is that the results will suggest that actually most of the passes are received on the move, and deceleration then comes into the requirements of the athlete in order to stop effectively. So if we look at the types of jump then that occur, so we have the options of vertical, lateral, forward, jump in, jump, turn in the air, or jump, land, pivot. Okay, the most prevalent jump involved was a forward direction with the wing attack, centre, and wing defence, all experiencing significantly more actions at this than players in the goal defence and goal shoot position. So this jumping with a forward direction. Okay, you're all netball coaches. You're thinking, okay, that's nothing new. That makes great sense. It's probably due to the limitations of space in the circle area. But in terms of implications for injury, the resultant posterior ground reaction force, right, required by these players to slow their horizontal momentum may actually increase the external flexion at the knee. This ultimately, unfortunately, may act as a mechanism for ACL injury. So implications for you coaches, for S&C coaches or conditioners, is that you should actually try to encourage a bilateral or a run-on strategy whilst training in order to lower these ground reaction forces generated on these knees when they make a forward jump. Now, the jump turn in the air, interestingly, all the players used a jump turn in the air land strategy, rather than the pivot landing. So this suggests a possible coaching intervention to reduce the use of this strategy, but which actually leads to instability issues in landing. So the video that we saw at the very start, one of the ANZ players jumped, turning a land ACL injury. Okay, when we're working with our youngsters, perhaps instead of working so hard on the jump, turn in the air land strategy, we should be encouraging more of the pivot landing. So if we move on to landing, we've got ankle joint movement options, and then we've got movements of the feet. So netballers predominantly landed with their foot in plantar flexion. Okay, so regardless of your position, generally you're going to be landing with your foot in that position of plantar flexion. Okay, generally speaking, the results showed it was going to be landing on the right leg. So you're plantar flexed, single foot on your right leg. When they were landing on a symmetrical basis, when they were landing with two legs, there was a tendency, regardless of their position, that they would have a symmetrical base. Now, again, when you look at the research for elite players, the symmetrical base is one which is not actually prevalent because the asymmetrical base leads to your ability to hold a greater space, so therefore put yourself in a better position from receive, turn, shoot. Whereas if you're in a symmetrical position, you don't have the opportunity to make the move forward towards the shooting hoop. So when we look at balance, the landing tended to be a dominant balance on the right leg. So as the players receive the ball, if there's an element of instability, then there's a tendency to sway over onto the right leg. This could be because most players are right-handed. It could be that if they're right side dominant, then that's the actions that they're used to. Again, there's a cause for concern here that with the dominant balance being on the right leg, it would be important to actually try to potentially consider that in training so that you can give the athletes the best opportunity to be able to sway left or sway right as is required. So for the stabilization actions, what we found with our players in New Zealand here is that the wing attack, centre and goal attack use significantly more ankle balance strategy than the other positions. So we've got the players as they're landing tending to either, if they're feeling unstable, they tend to sway onto their right side, and that final stabilization tends to come from ankle movements. Now again, when I actually look back at the ACC, which is our accident statistics, there is a high incidence of ankle injuries in netball. So netball tends to be an ankle injury, or it tends to be an ACL injury. So the static receiving may explain, which we spoke about earlier, that actually may explain this high incidence of this ankle strategy, because if you're not on the move when you're landing, then it takes a smaller mechanism to maintain that stable balance. So that's potentially one of the reasons why the ankle stabilization strategy was used most frequently throughout this secondary schools tournament. Now the least strategy used was the step strategy. From the perspective of the research and injury, this is a strategy with the reduced likelihood of injury. So if you're looking to try to reduce injuries amongst your squad, then the step strategy is the one which the research supports that you practice. It's a difficult skill to master because of the footwork rule. So implications are there for technique improvement when you're designing your coaching sessions. And I think it's an awareness issue here that when you're working with your athletes to try to get them to think about how do they stabilize themselves when they're landing. So as I said, the second part of our study was to try to consider whether if we took these landing strategy variables and we then used those to see if we could predict which grade were the sample players in. So we used this thing called a logistic regression, right? And we identified a few variables which were the ones which enabled us to predict grade. So we've got the more catching with both hands, the fewer jump, turn, in air lands, and the more balance using step strategy, and the less landing neutral feet wide outside border. These were the 4 variables which enabled our model to correctly predict the grade of the player. Now, this model actually predicted 88%, right, in terms of grade. So when you're looking from a sort of not necessarily a selection criteria, but when you're looking at players and you're thinking about how can you help that player to improve from a coaching perspective, okay, more catching with both hands, more using the balance step in order to stabilize yourself, fewer landing with a neutral feet outside of your body's border, and fewer jump turn in airs. That would be the suggestion that that's what elite players or the better players tend to use. So basically, fewer rotational jumps and wider base landings were associated with a higher grade. Okay, so practical applications. And I've tried to sort of talk about the coaching applications as we've gone through this presentation. And, you know, coaches and conditioners, it's really important that we design the training environment to embrace these landing strategies and look at how they're associated with each specific position. So we sort of suggested some coaching implications, which in our discussions with Netball New Zealand, you know, they've been thinking about. And it would be to encourage players to use jumps which are direct, i.e. non-rotational. Try and encourage them to do this as frequently as possible, and discouraging a wide base on landing using a balance step, right, to try to reduce the strain on the body. When you're selecting teams for matches and tournaments, coaches and conditioners need to prepare each athlete for the demands of the position that they play and to not rely on a general level of physical conditioning. And it's incredibly important in this that you think about, you know, you've got a week for our athletes here. This is a week-long tournament, and they don't usually play week-long tournaments apart from this particular one. And the physios are incredibly busy at the end of this week because of the high number of injuries. So it's important across a tournament where, due to this increased intensity and duration, with a very high injury risk, that if coaches are rotating players into a different position in a match, and these players have not trained particularly for a long period of time in these different positions, then it's really important that the coaches, hopefully, you know, with this presentation, are a little bit more aware of the detrimental impact that the variation of landing strategies for position will actually have on the player's performance when placed in what I refer to as their non-usual position. So these are the references which I've used to form some of the basis of this presentation. Thank you very much, and I think Wilbur, now we have an opportunity for some questions. So again, thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed it. I have related it to the work we've been doing here in New Zealand with secondary schools, but I think the concepts of how to analyze the jumping and landing is something which transcends countries. So I've been working very closely with Netball New Zealand in terms of looking at these different landing strategies, and we've been doing this at a younger age group as well. So this is a piece of work, as I said, which aimed at the secondary school age in our national competition. But what we're doing here in New Zealand is looking to take some of these concepts and see if we can implement it in our junior coaching programs, so that we have athletes who are better prepared and less likely to be injured as they develop. Thank you very much.